Do you remember a time when you could just use your own property as you saw fit?
It is extraordinary in a sense, because not only does it appear to go against conservative principles, but it's so easy not to do this stuff. And all you need to do is just not simply do nothing. Because most of the world, if not the entire world, is not doing what the UK government is doing in the area of the Nanny State.
They are going to have to put economic freedom at the centre of what they're all about. It is a 100% necessary condition for any kind of success.
Well, welcome to this second Institute of Economic Affairs panel discussion. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I am currently the Acting Director of Communications here at the IEA. I am absolutely delighted that all of you are so interested in the pursuit of liberty. That's absolutely wonderful. So we're going to be talking about whether or not the Conservative Party can actually rediscover that love of liberty, which seems to have lost not just in the last few years, but of course, over the last few decades. I mean, of course, this year, the election campaign was fought on things like national service, compulsory voluntary national service, and the generational tobacco ban, telling adults of the future what they can and cannot do with their own bodies. We have countless examples of the government effectively intervening ever so much in our lives. And so the question is whether or not that invigoration, that passion for liberty can indeed be sought after in the near future. I have a star panel with me today. So to my right, I have the absolutely wonderful Lord David Frost, who is the Conservative member of the House of Lords. He was Europe advisor to Boris Johnson, and was chief negotiator for exiting the EU back in 2019 to 2020. He was then the Cabinet Minister for Relations with the EU until he stepped down from the government in December of 2021. Lord Frost frequently writes for the Daily Telegraph and elsewhere. Would recommend reading his pieces. Dr. Christopher Snowdon, to my far left. Dr. Christopher Snowdon is the head of lifestyle economics at the IEA. He has a degree in history from Leicester and a PhD in economics from the University of Buckingham. He is the author of many excellent publications, including one of my favourites, Killjoys. And to my left is Tom Clougherty, who is the Executive Director and Ralph Harris Fellow at the IEA. He joined the IEA in December of 2023, having spent nearly 2 decades holding senior roles at various different think tanks, both in the UK and over in the US. So without further ado, let's start off with Lord Frost. You have 5 minutes. State your case.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Reem. Thank you to the IEA for having me. 5 minutes. Here's my prop. Those of you at the front can see this is F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. It's 80 years this month since this book was published, and it's still as relevant as ever. And I produce it not just for a prop and to make that point, but to remind us that this battle for freedom has its phases. 80 years ago, things looked bad. They probably looked a lot worse, actually, when you read this book. But the battle was won, at least briefly, or at least there was a pushback under the Thatcher government. And now things have been going in the opposite direction once again. But these things do go in phases. We mustn't get too down. The battle can be won. However, when one looks at the record of the Conservative government for the last 20 years or so, it is quite easy to get depressed. And we could all spend a long time going through the many, many unconservative, anti-freedom things that this government did. It's gone along, basically, with what I think is the zeitgeist of collectivism that we see across the parties in this country. And so everything has, or many, many things have gone with that. The smoking ban, the restrictions on the rental market, low traffic networks, airline taxes, the failure to reform planning, the doubling down on planning restrictions, obviously the very high levels of tax and spend. The Conservative government has presided over an ideology, almost a state ideology of diversity and inclusion, that certainly in the public sector you are pretty well required to pay due obeisance to. And more broadly, there are constraints on free speech, which we did nothing about and indeed made worse during our 20 years. So things have gone quite wrong. Why? I think part of it is a very big trend across the West. There is a move to collectivism generally, and I think some of this is down to a lack of ideological sharpness, probably after the end of the Cold War, that the great ideological battle seemed over, and we no longer needed to keep referring to the things that were making Western societies successful, and I think that is quite a part of it. I think the modernisation of the Conservative Party itself, so-called modernisation, took it soft left, and I think made us very complacent about the link between free enterprise and economic growth. And I think things took a turn for the worse since the bailouts. In 2008, the banking crash, the huge bailouts, the sense that the state would always be behind you, the growth of a series of other bad ideas then. I would say the whole way we've approached net zero is very top-down, very statist, very anti-freedom, energy caps, any subsidies, and of course the pandemic, which was the issue that I in the end resigned over in 2021. I think we've lost this belief in markets and the Hayekian sort of self-organising properties of society. We've lost that belief as a party. We've come to think subliminally that government must always be involved in solving problems. And I think, we have given in to the, how to put it, the sort of collectivisation of policy making, the sense that because the government does something like run the health service, we all have this duty to act in a way that maintains the health service. There's always a justification for going along with the government's ideological goals. So I think some of these big trends are going to be very difficult to fight. How do we recover our love of freedom? It is very difficult because now where we've got to, it involves saying a lot of unpalatable things to a lot of people, and in the short run, making life more difficult for people. We've got to try and develop an ideology, again, as a party, and stick to it and explain it. Conservatives are too often the party of sort of pragmatism and muddling through and not having an ideology, but you do need an ideology. We need to convince ourselves that we are on the wrong path and we need to go back. But I would say maybe two things just to finalise. One, that there are still people out there, a lot of people who believe in freedom. And the column I got the biggest reaction to in the Telegraph over the last couple of years was one I wrote about rent control and housing, where I said, do you remember a time when you could just use your own property as you saw fit without having to sort of go along with the government's ideological presumptions? And that got a huge reaction. So I think there are people still out there. Last thing, I think, as a party, we've got to try and make freedom exciting. Too often we make it sound like a burden, like something you've got to do. Your life's got to be more difficult for this ideological goal. And it isn't. Freedom is about doing your own thing, running your own life, devising your own projects and getting on with them, and being a grown-up. If you like. And we just need to get back to some of that excitement of freedom, away from the gloom of collectivism, away from this belief that the government must always be there for you. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
What else?
A passionate defence of freedom if I've ever seen one. Dr. Christopher Snowdon.
Thank you. I'd like to talk specifically about the Nanny State, which David's already alluded to. It does seem certain that we're going to be in for 5 years of nanny statism. It's been remarkable, really, given how little time the Labour Party have been in office, how much nanny state stuff they've at least flown a kite for. But I think for a lot of consumers of tobacco, vapes, alcohol, gambling products, food, and so on, it's not going to feel that much different. It'll just be somebody with a red rosette saying, I believe in the nanny state and, or I don't believe in free markets and, as opposed to somebody with a blue rosette saying, I hate the nanny state but, or I really like free markets but, which has been the story of the last 14 years. When I first came to this conference, it was the last year the Conservatives were in opposition. And at the time, there was a lot of complaints about the nanny statism of Blair and Brown and the tendency to ban things that that the government didn't like. And the suggestion was that might change when the Conservatives came into power, and of course it didn't. The Nanny State has blossomed in a way that was well beyond, I think, Tony Blair's imagination in the last 14 years, which is extraordinary in a sense, because not only does it appear to go against Conservative principles, but it's so easy not to do this stuff. All you need to do is just simply do nothing. You know, there are lots of areas of public policy where you need to do... There are lots of very difficult problems facing the government in terms of sorting out healthcare and social care and housing, where you need to pick fights with people, you need to make unpopular decisions. But with this stuff, you just need to ignore a very, very small number of tiny pressure groups who are asking for this stuff. And if you do ignore them, they generally actually go away. You might remember that David Cameron at one point was in favour of minimum pricing for alcohol. And then he decided actually he wasn't going to do it. And he made it very clear to the pressure groups he wasn't going to do it. And they just shut up about it. They just shut up. They never raised it again. They've started mentioning it again now because they think Keir Starmer might be in the market for it. But if you make it's rather like dealing with a small child. If you make it very clear that you're not going to buckle no matter how much they whine, they really will go away, or at least be quiet. And you can tell that doing nothing is a very good option with these things, because most of the world, if not the entire world, is not doing what the UK government is doing in the area of the Nanny States. I don't think people realise quite what an outlier we are. Just to give you three particularly important examples. One is the ban on so-called junk food advertising online and before 9 p.m. on television. The government has recently confirmed this is going to take place in October next year. No other country is doing anything like it. Anything like it. The BBC wrote an article about this saying which other countries have already done this, assuming some other countries have already done it. They haven't. Norway is thinking about restricting this kind of advertising during children's TV programmes, which is in fact what we did under Blair in 2007. Portugal is thinking about doing the same thing. Nobody else is even considering anywhere near such an extensive ban on such an extensive list of foods, which people to this day I don't think actually realise how extensive the category of so-called junk food is. The second one is, of course, the generational tobacco ban, which no other country in the world is doing. It was famously nicked from the New Zealand Labour Party of Jacinda Ardern. She then got booted out of office. They got an actually Conservative government in. They said this is not the kind of thing the Conservative government should be doing. And nobody else is seriously looking at this idea, which has cross-party support. It's almost impossible to find a party to vote for if you're against this particular policy. Maybe Reform, because Farage smokes, but everybody else seems to be completely up with this. Literally a year ago, you couldn't find a single party. If you wanted to prohibit tobacco, there wasn't a party to vote for. Now there isn't a party that seems to be against it. And I say, no other country has done it. The last country, such as it is, to have banned tobacco is the Islamic State. The one before that was Bhutan, and they got rid of the ban in 2021 because there were so many smugglers coming over the border, they were worried about spreading COVID. These are not sensible policies, but they are also not mainstream policies. Another one in the area of gambling, which is dishonestly portrayed as a public health issue, affordability checks. What a lovely idea. We'll just check if people can afford to spend the amount of money they're spending on gambling. It's completely impractical. It's yet another of these 3 a.m. kind of ideas that the various governments have come up with. There's no way of doing it. Goodness knows how the Gambling Commission is going to attempt to do it. But more to the point, nobody else is doing it. You know, we are an outlier. We are not. I mean, it's not that you mentioned the Zeitgeist. We're actually beyond the Zeitgeist. We are out on a limb with these things. And all these policies were Tory policies. And all the Labour Party have had to do is just take them off the shelf, put some bells and whistles on them, tighten them up even more. But they were, to quote a phrase, oven ready when the Labour Party came in. I would just like to finish by saying something about why you should oppose these things, really. I mean, there are lots of reasons, both in terms of principle and pragmatism. But there's a particular sinister rationale, which Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting made quite explicit, and Sunak kind of alluded to at the conference last year, and David's kind of alluded to it already, the idea that we are there to protect the NHS. This obviously was a big motif during the pandemic, which at least was an infectious disease, unlike these other things, which are really nobody else's business. But the idea is, and Starmer seems to genuinely believe this, that it is not the NHS needs to be reformed, it's the general public. And that is the only way to save the NHS. This, as it happens, is economically nonsense. I won't go into the details, but it just simply is not true that by addressing these so-called lifestyle-related diseases, you save money in the long term, you actually increase spending in the long term. But even if it were true, I think it would be an extremely dangerous idea to put into the mainstream. You don't need a lot of imagination to see the number of things, the amount of regimentation of life that would come about if the main responsibility of us as individuals was to make the NHS as efficient as possible. So for that reason alone, I think we should be opposing it, but we should be opposing it on principle. And I don't want somebody saying, I hate the nanny state, but I don't want someone saying, I love the nanny state, and I want somebody to say, I hate the nanny state, and let's be consistent in what we're actually saying. And now that the Conservative Party is opposition, presumably it will start opposing lots of this stuff. And that will take a bit of a U-turn, given that they've introduced or tried to introduce so much of this stuff. But presumably the Conservative Party is going to have to U-turn on things like national service and say, we're under new management now, things are going to be a bit different. And I hope that personal liberty will be a big part of the party under whatever management it has.
It's an interesting perspective on the practical implications of these kind of policies, but also from a first principles basis to believe in liberty. Tom?
Sure, Reem, thank you. So has the Conservative Party lost its love of freedom? I'll wait till the questions before coming to a firm conclusion about this room, but I rather suspect not for those of us gathered here. But when we look at the Conservatives in government, it seems undoubtedly to be the case that love of liberty was lost. And we've already heard many examples from the issues of consumer freedom that Chris works on, David resigning over lockdowns and the heavy-handed approach taken there. We can think about free speech and those kind of issues as well. I want to focus, as you may expect from the Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, on economic freedom. So the first question, I suppose, is about whether the Conservatives lost their love of freedom and why. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The second part, though, is how do they rediscover it? First of all, can Conservatives rediscover that love of freedom? And secondly, what might that look like? And just to preempt the answer on that, I don't only think that the Conservatives can rediscover a love of freedom. I think they have to discover a love of freedom. And, I'm not necessarily the person to ask, what should be in the manifesto, what should your election ads look like, and that kind of thing. I'm not even really a conservative. It's not how I describe myself. But I think that any kind of conservatism that doesn't contain within it a sort of classical liberal free market strain cannot cope, cannot deal with the big challenges that we are going to face as a society. And so even if you do manage to get elected, you will quickly suffer the same fate that it seems in record time the Labour government is discovering, which is to say they don't have a theory of change, they don't know what they're trying to achieve, and so they are immediately swamped by all of these political process stories, and the wheels have fallen off before they've even started down the road. So look, we talked about lifestyle freedoms, I mentioned free speech, we mentioned lockdowns, but let's talk more about economic freedom. You heard a lot of rhetoric, positive rhetoric about free markets and economic freedom from the Conservatives in 14 years in government. It waxed and waned over that period, but there was plenty of it. I think particularly in the period after Brexit, it did seem like there was a moment there that there could be radical change in a free market direction. Indeed, that's the main reason that I returned from America. I was working in think tanks over there. I wanted to come back to Britain because I saw in Brexit, whether you supported it in principle or not, the opportunity for radical change. I thought, I suppose rather grandly, that it could be like my generation's end of the Cold War, where you tear up the old rules and suddenly you can make decades worth of change, generational change, very quickly. Now, that really didn't happen. I don't know if you noticed, but it didn't happen. Why? Why didn't it happen? I think, first of all, among Conservative politicians, the commitment to the principled foundations of a kind of freedom politics was just lost. I think there was that shift, and it was a rational response to kind of the success of New Labour, a sort of a slick branding project, a very professional style of technocratic managerial politics. Maybe Conservatives absorbed the idea that that was what the public wanted now, and if Conservatives would just give it to them, they keep being voted for. Well, I mean, you did win several elections in a row, right? So it's not entirely without foundation. Nevertheless, I think it left Conservatives without a clear lodestar for what they were trying to do with power. I think the other thing, though, and this for the think tankers was maybe the most frustrating thing over the last 8 years, lots of people who gave every indication of being attached to the principles and having some rudimentary understanding of them. And David, I'll exclude you from this. I want to be clear about that. But when some of these people got into positions of power, what happened? Next to nothing. Again and again and again. And I think that speaks to the fact that Conservatives didn't, even if they were attached to the ideas in the abstract, they didn't know how to deliver them in practice. They didn't know how to get Whitehall to deliver that kind of economic freedom agenda. And that was a huge problem. And I can really kind of almost pinpoint the moment, for me, where it was just clear that the wheels had kind of come off this whole project, because there are a cluster of things post-Brexit, I don't know if it was sort of 2017, 18, 19, where you had a Conservative government trying to address quite big policy problems, but they were doing so without even a nod towards free market economics or market-oriented reform. The one that I was particularly struck by was the proposed reforms to social care. Now, throughout my sort of think tank working life, whenever there had been a sort of public service problem to try and address, the approach had been like, how do we make the market work here? How do we extend kind of choice and competition and personal responsibility? And whenever it was in that post-Brexit period, this issue came sort of, to the top of politics. And there was no hint at that. By the way, throughout the New Labour years, market-oriented public service reform was a huge part of that Blair agenda. Now, whether they delivered on it appropriately or effectively is another question, but it was always there intellectually. Suddenly, with a Conservative government, what did you get? You got, the government needs to spend more money, so we're going to put up taxes. All right. You saw the same kind of thing with net zero. This is from a Conservative government with supposedly lots of free marketeers around. It wasn't even a market-oriented approach to trying to decarbonise. It was a long-term plan, a series of targets and budgets and top-down government controls and regulations. So again, completely lost the plot, in my view, on this stuff. Now, look, what I don't want to say sitting up here is if you just all agree with me, or if whoever ends up leading the Conservative Party just agrees with me and says all the things I believe going to a general election, suddenly they'll be wildly popular. Right? I'm not sure that that's actually the case. I don't think my own politics have ever been wildly popular. They may be correct. I hope they are. But popularity is not necessarily the condition I most ascribe to them. I think what we need, and I've probably run slightly over time, let me draw this together. I think that if the Conservative Party is going to succeed, not just in winning elections, but actually in governing effectively, in dealing with the big problems we face, which I think are largely rooted in economic stagnation and a whole host of unfortunate consequences that go along with that, they are going to have to put economic freedom at the centre of what they're all about. It is a 100% necessary condition for any kind of success. Is it sufficient? I suspect probably not. I think that this has to be a broad political movement, broader than my own personal political beliefs, broader than many of the things that the IEA works on. But I think what we need now is probably what we had in the US and in the UK in the 1980s, and which proved to be so successful, which is a new fusionism, which puts free markets and economic freedom at the heart of a centre-right agenda, but which fuses it with certain other aspects of this right-of-centre tradition that can appeal to a broad and wide audience and win popular support. Alongside that, though, we do actually have to really get to grips with the enemy, if I can use that term, the enemy that we are dealing with, and that is the modern bureaucratic state, which I think is understudied, massively misunderstood or little understood. And it doesn't matter how committed to the principles you are. It doesn't matter how many voters you get behind you. After all, 2019 sort of massive electoral victory for a free market, seemingly free market Conservative Party, and we saw what happened afterwards. You have to know how you are going to implement change. You have to know how you are going to how you're actually going to govern, right? And I think that you can't be in the situation again where you were in government but not in power. And so there is a huge amount of thinking and a huge amount of research that I think needs to go into this project. It's not easy. I can't reel everything off for you now, but I think this is a good place to start. So you have to put economic freedom at the centre of a new conservative fusion if you want to be successful. Thank you.
Absolutely excellent. So we've heard a little bit about economic freedom and why that needs to be at the centre of any kind of vision for valuing this kind of vision for the future of liberty. We've got somebody that resigned from government over this very principle, and we have the perspective that actually these lifestyle freedoms need to be taken very, very seriously. Now, what I find really interesting about this discussion in particular is there seems to be a clear indication that there is first principle, the idea that people should be able to do things with their own lives, with their own bodies. They should be allowed to make their own economic choices because it is moral, because it is right for them to do that from a first principles basis. And then there is all of those consequences as a result. We see that people are able to own more of their own property. They're able to live better lives, happier lives, healthy lives. They're able to choose their own destiny, their own future of happiness. Or indeed, in a lot of Chris's research, which looks at effectively things like the generational tobacco ban, which have all of these terrible unintended consequences. So we've got the first principles: we believe in freedom because we believe in freedom, because we believe it's moral, because we believe it's just. And then the consequences of that. Now, marrying those two things together, I think, is really interesting. So my first question to the panel is, how do you then convince everybody outside of this room that that is the way forward, not just from a consequentialist perspective, the tobacco ban is bad because we'll see loads and loads of illegal products being produced, but actually the tobacco ban is bad because it is immoral for the government to tell adults what they can and cannot do with their own bodies. How do we convince them?
Well, I don't see much of a clash between the two things you mentioned. I mean, freedom is, I take freedom as a first principle because I think freedom actually produces the best outcomes. Now, Charlie would probably call me a utilitarian for that, and would probably find things we could disagree on. But generally speaking, I think it is true to say that free markets produce the best outcomes and individual freedom produces the best outcomes, with the caveat that there can be negative externalities you need to deal with, and you can have sensible regulation, and you want to keep the kind of products I'm talking about out of the hands of children. But it is, history shows that prohibition doesn't just not work in the sense of actually prohibiting, but also causes all sorts of other problems. Australia at the moment is up to about 110 in a number of fire bombings of tobacconists. Hasn't really made the papers over here, which is kind of surprising because it's quite an extraordinary story. But they haven't got prohibition of tobacco. They have prohibition of e-cigarettes, which hasn't helped, and they have the highest cigarette taxes in the world. And now organised criminals are essentially telling corner shops and tobacconists, either you sell our counterfeit products or we're going to firebomb you. And I say they've had over 100 firebombings. That is a consequence of neo-prohibitionism, not even full prohibition. So you have all sorts of negative consequences. But the main negative consequence of kind of coercive paternalistic action is very difficult to quantify. But it is basically that people cannot lead the lives that they want to lead. They cannot access necessarily their first preference and have to settle at best for their second preference. And you are causing actual harm to people if you're stopping people doing what they like. Now, many of you here may not eat so-called junk food, and most of you probably don't smoke, and some of you won't drink. But I would ask you to think of the things that you do enjoy doing, whatever they may be, and consider what would happen if the government decided to charge an 800% tax on them, as we do with whiskey and cigarettes, or indeed ban them outright. So we might think subjectively that these things are not good, and in many cases objectively they are not good for your health, but health is not the only thing that matters, and that's what we seem to have lost track of in this discussion. The only people who seem to have any say in the matter are rather fanatical far left groups like the British Medical Association, and these tiny, often state-funded pressure groups who you could fit into a mini metro. And so the whole debate has become unbalanced by this obsessive focus on health, which is a very important part of well-being, but it is not the only part of well-being. And joy and pleasure and leading the life that you want to lead are at least equally important, and they seem to be been tossed to the side for reasons I genuinely cannot understand, because it seems to me that a lot of the people who say I hate the nanny state but, and I believe in free markets but, probably really do at least think that they believe in these things. And yet for 14 years we've had one thing after another. And I suspect that a lot of Conservative ministers in particular probably look back on the last 14 years, think about the reasons they became a Conservative in the first place, which involves quite a lot of hatred being thrown at you. You know, you would think you have to be fairly committed to something if you're going to go through the horrible process of becoming a candidate, standing for election and kissing babies and knocking on doors and all the rest of it, and yet spend your political career doing the exact opposite of all the things you supposedly believe in. It's very puzzling and probably very disappointing for those people. But let's not do it again if we get the chance.
David, what's your perspective? How do you then marry those two things and actually convince people that from a first principles basis, valuing freedom and the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of a free society, as Hayek did, you said 80 years ago it was published, as Hayek did, how do we convince them?
I think, I guess I am quite utilitarian about this in the sense that to persuade people, I think results matter. And we don't, I think, talk about the successes of the free market. I mean, if you go back to the 80s when the post office was privatised and it became British Telecom and everything that came from that, nobody wanted that to happen. But actually it turned out that people liked the results. And because the government was quite an ideological, freedom-based government, it sort of talked it up and people understood why this was happening. And we don't do that now. I mean, two examples of, where the power of the free market and sort of private sector decision-making were important quite recently was, first of all, in the pandemic, where the private sector responded incredibly quickly to all the restrictions, all the constraints, didn't have any of the difficulties of the public sector. And if you think back on it, how quickly supermarkets and other consumer-facing private sector organisations adapted to that, really with very little grinding of gears at all. It's an incredible demonstration of the power of the private sector, yet nobody ever talks about that. We're seeing it again now, and I can understand why people don't talk about my second example, but it is a powerful example, and it is in health. We are seeing the burgeoning of a private health market as people begin to give up on the NHS. And it's happening extremely quickly. A lot of things that you just couldn't do a couple of years ago, you can now do, and for surprisingly little money. Now, so that's something I could see why it's difficult to use as an example. But nevertheless, the power of markets to get things to happen really, really quickly and change the way things are is something that we just don't like to talk about. And I think we should talk about it a lot more because people like it.
Consequences and success stories certainly do matter. Tom,
I mean, picking up on that, David, I mean, it astonished me during and in the wake of the pandemic that after, we'd all benefited from being able to have all our food and everything we wanted delivered to us at home and stream stuff on our televisions and everything and remain entertained. All anyone wanted to talk about was whether Amazon and Jeff Bezos should be subject to a windfall tax, right? Rather than saying what an extraordinary feat of logistics, not just Amazon, but, the commercial sector as a whole, managed to pull off in that context to keep us all supplied with the things we needed and wanted. And yet there's something in our politics, you called it, David, in your opening remarks, the zeitgeist of collectivism. We need desperately to change that zeitgeist. And that's one of the things that Hayek wrote about a lot. And one of the things actually that Hayek said and did that really inspired the foundation of the IEA nearly 70 years ago was this idea that you needed to change the intellectual climate in a country, and the politics was downstream of that. And it was in another one of his essays, Intellectuals and Socialism, where he talks about this a lot, that the intellectual climate is really set by this crowd of people who today we would call opinion formers. And to win them over, it can't just be practical, technocratic, managerial stuff. You have to actually be a little bit utopian. You have to actually be able to inspire people and win them round to your cause. Now, it wasn't just about first principles. First principles work for some people. For many people, they just think, well, those aren't my first principles, and that's the end of the conversation. You've got to go to the next level, and that's trying to reach people with reasoned argument and with evidence and show them that your ideas are good ones, that they've succeeded before, that they'll succeed again. And if you start winning enough people around to that point of view, the intellectual climate, that zeitgeist can start to shift. But there's also a third element to this, which is to sort of go beyond showing people the evidence in advance, is to go beyond talking them through the first principles of something. And I think it comes from Roger Douglas, who was the New Zealand finance minister when they had an extraordinary bout of liberalisation. He was a Labour finance minister, by the way, in the 1980s. And an expression he used was that you've got to let the dog see the rabbit. And basically, this was the idea that the public, they might not agree with the first principles, the voters, of a freedom politics. They might not be that interested in listening to or reading your studies of the empirical effect of deregulation in this sector or that sector. They're probably completely oblivious to most of these aspects of political debate in a way that people in this room won't be. But what they will see are the positive consequences of effective policy change. But that means if you get into government, you've got to do it, and you've got to do it quickly, because the clock is ticking, and you want some of those positive consequences of growth and liberalisation and so on to be obvious by the time you go to the voters again. So it all speaks to that kind of detailed, well-thought-out plan in advance, which I think was sorely lacking over the last 14 years. It's lacking again now with different people in charge, so maybe it's a systematic problem. But next time Conservatives have the opportunity, they really need to make sure they take it.
It's also interesting from that perspective, the way in which the Overton window, or I suppose the sort of window of what is possible for government to intervene in, has shifted because the Conservatives effectively set it that way. So on lifestyle freedoms, the fact that the Conservative government went as far as we're going to implement a generational tobacco ban, for example, it meant that the Labour government could then go even further because the sort of consensus is so far gone towards interventionism that it went so far that way that it meant that they could only...
That was the thing.
Yeah.
The Tories and the party of big business and incredibly libertarian and so on. So in order to make his stamp, West Street can't just heat up the tobacco and vapes bill as it was. He has to put lots of bells and whistles. Also, we're going to ban you smoking outdoors.
I mean, politically, they have to go even further, right? So I think what's interesting is how they can then save face. I remember before the when Sunak actually announced the generational tobacco ban at Conservative Party conference a year ago, people were sort of saying, well, there's no going back from this. How can a particular politician go back from arguing for such a huge, unprecedented intervention in people's lives and then go back on that? There was no way from a political perspective. For you guys, what do you think is the sort of element of that perspective where we can actually practically implicate it? So a lot of people in this room believe that, yes, pursuing freedom, pursuing those elements of a free society is what's needed for Britain to prosper. How do we practically get there? David?
Well, as I said, I think it's partly kind of making the case, it's partly showing results, and it's partly recovering the ideology ourselves. And I think one of the things that worries me most about the Tory party at the moment is the way it has been, I was going to say captured, it's not quite true. There is a very, very strong, what I would call a sort of heresy within the party, which is that if Conservatives are in charge of a kind of active state, a state knows best policy, it's okay. And all the things that Conservatives know about what happens when you allow the state and the public sector to get in charge of things, all the sort of political economy problems that gives you. Somehow a lot of Conservatives think that doesn't matter as long as Conservatives are kind of in charge of it. And so we get this heresy of, industrial policy and the active state, and, the politicians know best about what the country needs to be prosperous in 20 years' time. And this seems to be quite deep-rooted now in the party. But we've got to change that, because to me it's just another version of an anti-freedom policy. It's government knows best. Government knows how things are going to be and can safely lead you to that destination. So we do have to recover the ideology. And people don't like talking about ideologies, but if you don't have an ideology, you don't have a reason to take one decision rather than another. You don't have anything that guides your direction of travel, and that is what we've seen, unfortunately. I think
one of the failings of the last government was it tended to do things on the basis of opinion polls too much and focus groups too much. And a lot of the policies I'm talking about, you can always find surveys saying that these things are pretty popular. You know, going back yet again to the generational tobacco ban, you know, it was announced last year by Rishi Sunak at the conference. I dare say that Onward, as someone had been doing some polling, saying that 70% of the population supports it. Well, firstly, I don't think actually most people even understand what the policy is. I just think they hear we're going to stop 14-year-olds from smoking, and people go, I don't want 14-year-olds to smoke. Therefore, and the more they understand about it, the more resistance there is. But more than that, you know, okay, he's announced this wonderfully popular policy. Where is he now? You know, I mean, how did that go in terms of the election? Is there realistically a single person in Britain who was voting Labour or Lib Dems or SNP who heard that speech and thought, right, I'm going to vote Conservative now? These people simply don't exist. Somebody who wants to prohibit something like that is always going to vote for one of the left-wing parties. So the opinion polls don't tell you a great deal. But even if they did, you know, if you look at Margaret Thatcher's manifesto in 1983 and indeed I think 1987, the policies themselves actually weren't that popular. You looked at them individually, they were not that popular. They preferred a lot of what Michael Foot was saying. Same with Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. Loads of people supported the policies individually, but they didn't vote for him and they didn't vote for Foot. And the reason is that there wasn't a central message, what you might call an ideology. You know, Margaret Thatcher, whatever you thought of individual policies to do with privatisation and you know, all the rest of it, there was a basic message that got through to people. And in a word, that was freedom. And the people who were never going to vote for that kind of thing didn't vote for her. But lots of people who were on the fence could see what she was getting at. And although they didn't necessarily agree with everything she said and the way she went about things, there was a clear message of what needed to be done. With 2019, it was even more simple. It was just get Brexit done versus this hodgepodge of, yeah, we're going to give you free internet and all the rest of it. So the popularity or not of various different policies doesn't actually matter as much as the main messages coming through. And I would like to believe that come the next election, the Conservative Party's message will be very much summed up in the word freedom.
I guess
and I think that would be popular.
It also matters what that freedom looks like. I mean, just Tom, on economic freedom, you know, we are in the middle of the Conservative Party's leadership election, and almost all candidates have spoken about some version of freedom. And yet, in some of the policies that they are promising to implement, were they to become leader of the party and indeed prime minister, they are, from at least our perspective, fundamentally anti-freedom. I mean, some policies being proposed, for example, things like increasing spending on particular things, or indeed that perception of what freedom looks like. So, on economic freedom, A, what does it mean, and B, how do we actually practically implement it?
I think, Dave, what was your most popular Telegraph column you referenced?
Yeah, the one on rental reform.
Right, but sort of remember when you owned a property and you could do what you wanted with it. I mean, in a way, that's sort of the essence of economic freedom. It really just means, you're free to trade. Find someone who wants to trade with you and it's mutually beneficial. You both benefit. And that's fine. Why does the government have to get in the way of that? And that's a simple principle, but it's a simple principle with quite profound consequences if you start applying it more broadly. I think that the biggest area that we need liberalisation, where we need to try and get rid of the barriers to growth, is in a whole cluster of issues associated with land use. And that was why I wanted to refer back to, if you have property, you can do what you want with it. I mean, okay, no modern government is ever going to go complete free-for-all on land use, on housing development, business development and everything else. But we can go a heck of a lot further in that direction by anyone's measure. And I think that would probably have the most immediate and enormous impact on our growth prospects in this country. If you could get back to the sort of system we had before the Second World War, where you owned land and there was a profitable opportunity to develop it, you're free to do so within some fairly commonsensical constraints. That seems to me to be the biggest and most important thing here.
I think it's interesting, even just harping back to Thatcher, which a lot of the candidates this year seem to be doing. And again, that perception that actually Thatcher wasn't necessarily popular in her first few years for any of those particular policies, and yet at the same time had an ideology and had that kind of conviction. Again, I don't necessarily like glorifying particular politicians, but I think that is an example where you can do things as a politician that are unpopular, or at least seen as unpopular, and have conviction at the same time. Right, I think we've been talking for too long. Let's hear from you guys. Yes, lots of questions. Excellent. We have a microphone for the recording at the back, I believe. Yeah, let's start here. You are straight up. We'll wait for the microphone.
Hi, Reem. Just two questions. The first one is, following the consistency of individual freedom, could you make the case for open borders? And my second question is just about a history about Hayek and some of his mentors. Could you just give some salient points about Arthur Sheldon, Anthony Fisher, who started the EEA, the Austrian school, and Ludwig von Mises?
Excellent. Okay.
So you want a lecture then?
Also, we'll go for the story. Let's take a couple of questions at a time, just so we have time for as many people. Let's do all of these. So here at the front.
Yep, thank you. Just, I'm really interested in this issue about how do we get people on board with the idea of freedom. When you look at what happened during the pandemic, basically people seem to be very keen to constrain other people's liberty, and they always seem to be quite keen to constrain other people's liberty. I'm from Scotland, and it's a very popular occupation in politics in Scotland to restrain other people's freedom. We have minimum unit pricing, we have hate crime legislation, all of these things. I love coming to England; it always feels freer. But but there is a really important question there. It is a seemingly very significant British instinct to constrain other people's freedom. How do you overcome that?
Those two at the back. Those three, yeah.
So good. How much is the civil service a problem in trying to drive freedom and deregulation?
I'm absolutely fascinated by what I've just heard. I'm uplifted, and congratulations to the three speakers, Reem. Over the last 25 years, I've watched what's happened to my country. Peter Mandelson was responsible in the early noughties for stopping the import of Chinese goods, which was destroying European industry and American industry. It was utterly appalling. Friends of mine were losing their jobs working for manufacturing companies. Since then, we've had the crash in 2008, just recovered from it, but we've not really got back to where we need to be. It was possible to manufacture things in this country and export them. We need to look at what we're good at. We need to promote what we're good at. We need to say we're good at all of these things. We need to uplift everybody. The depression at the moment with Keir Starmer is just quite unbelievable. We need to uplift everybody. I believe you've only got one voter to convince. Just one voter. Okay? But it's multiplied by at least 30 million times. And that's the silent majority. Just work for the silent majority. Thank you.
Last one, and then we'll go to the panel and come back to you guys. Yeah, just Nick.
I think, do you think perhaps we're beating ourselves up a little too much? We have 14 years. The first 5 years we was hobbled by being in coalition with the bloody Lib Dems. Then we had the Brexit referendum. The next 3 years we were hobbled because more than half of the parliamentary parties were in favour of remaining rather than leaving. And then we had the pandemic, which really trained people to be regulated. So I think we're being a little unfair on ourselves, but there we are.
Excellent. Do you want to... Okay, Tom, do you want to... Well, first of all, answer the first question about Arthur Seldon. Who is he?
Well, I mean...
Steve Barker could
Arthur Seldon was one of the sort of founding fathers, if you like, of the IEA, the editorial director, so the guy in charge of the research. And he was there with his colleague Ralph Harris, who was the original director for the best part of 3 decades and then hanging around afterwards. And I think really responsible for a lot of the great intellectual work that was going on in that period. I won't give you I have a lecture I give to our interns when they arrive every quarter, which goes into a lot more detail on this kind of stuff. I do think that our founder, Sir Anthony Fisher, was an amazing man. He was a war hero. He sort of revolutionised agriculture in Britain. He's also known as the man who put a chicken in every Englishman's pot. And then he founded the Institute of Economic Affairs on Friedrich Hayek's advice, and I think helped to turn the intellectual tide post-war through his sort of vision and everything. I mean, I could touch on all of those questions, but it would take ages. Maybe do you want me to just do the open borders one quickly, and I'll leave the rest.
If you could, please.
I'm not an expert on von Mises, I have to say. So we have published a primer by Eamon Butler on Ludwig von Mises, which is available for free on our website. So I'd go there in the first instance for that kind of thing. The open borders question, I think, is an interesting one, right? Because conservatives in general, but conservatives at the moment in particular, there is a big push and an understandable push, and frankly, a politically essential push. I mean, I can see that towards a more restrictive immigration system. And it is very clear, whatever you make of the merits of the argument one way or another, one of the big ways that an awful lot of natural conservatives, if you want to use that term, have fallen out of love with the Conservative Party is the repeated betrayals, and particularly since Brexit, on that immigration question. I say all that as a preface to saying the IEA, some of you may know this, has generally been a more liberal-minded organisation. We don't really have a corporate view, but generally speaking, our researchers and so on tend to be on the side of more open borders, more freedom of movement, rather than less. So I think that there's a principled argument there. In pure economic terms, labour is a factor of production. Why is it any different from any of the other ones? Surely you should be able to import and export it in that way. I think that there's a kind of universality to classical liberal principles, which doesn't want to say this person has less value than that person because they were born in a different country and they hold a different citizenship. Now, this is on the level of pure economics and it's on the level of pure philosophy. I think that practically speaking, and I'll speak for myself, not for the organisation as a whole, but I would say that has to be significantly tempered by the practicalities of the situation. And I think even Milton Friedman would have said, open borders is probably not consistent with having a modern welfare state, right? And also, if you have relatively open borders in a situation where public services and the provision of infrastructure are not just incapable of responding to increased demand with increased supply, but for the most part are strictly prohibited from responding to increased demand with increased supply, you are going to build up a whole host of social and political problems and economic problems for yourself because of that mismatch of supply and demand. So this is not the crowd to sit here and give the libertarian case for open borders to. But what I'm saying is that even among libertarians, I think that there is a degree of realism about the economic constraints, the social constraints, and the political constraints. I would say, on the other hand, though, that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Britain does want to keep attracting talented people who can contribute. And it would be a shame to send the contrary impression. Some of my friends talk about Britain, and this speaks to our wider discussion actually, as feeling a bit like a narco-tyranny, which is to say that if you go to the English Channel, there are the small boats coming across, there is a semblance of no control whatsoever. If, and I've done this, you try and bring in a foreign spouse who has multiple master's degrees, you spend years of your life doing it, you waste countless thousands of pounds, and it's a horrendous bureaucratic process for no real advantage to anybody. So you have the sense of anarchy on the one hand and the sense of tyranny on the other, and they're kind of the wrong way around.
Very well put, Tom. David, I wonder if you can answer the question specifically on trade. I mean, the notion that actually, should we be importing more? Should we be exporting more? Should it be the government that says, well, we're really good at these things, let's do more of this? Can you actually explain why, what comparative advantages and why free trade is more important?
So I'll try and answer that. There's a couple of other points I'd like to come back to, but I do think that, I think this audience understands comparative advantage and Ricardo and all that sort of thing, I'm sure, but I think that, I would distinguish the national security case on trade from the general case for free trade. I think it is legitimate for governments to take a national security view on certain products and certain countries. Now, of course, the problem is that tends to be used far more widely than it really should be, and you get into the French sort of strategic yogurt production that we had a few years ago. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say, in the world as we have it at the moment, I wouldn't say the correct policy is open borders to every country and let's just see what happens. I think you have to look at who your friends and who your opponents are and be a bit more sophisticated about your trade policy than that. So that's my constraint on it. I think the question you asked here about why do people like telling everybody what to do all the time, and especially in Scotland, I don't know about the second bit of that, but George Orwell says somewhere in his essays that one of the things English people hate being called most is nosy Parker. And so to me that shows, A, things have changed, but also that strand in the British character has always been there. But in the past, it was something to be mocked, generally. If you look at, Warden Hodges in Dad's Army, for example, he's a figure of fun in that. And what's happened in the last 20 years, I think, is that people have stopped being figures of fun. And I think some of this is down to, honestly, I think it's due to net zero and environmentalism and lifestyle preaching and the need to make sort of public demonstrations of your kind of worthiness in the way you live your life all the time. Some of that has sort of sunk in to people. And some of it, obviously, is the pandemic. I think it took a big turn in the pandemic, and we're not coming back from that anytime soon, unfortunately. But I think the answer is to mock as far as we can this tendency in people, rather than very earnestly say that you kind of understand what they're about, but let's make fun of them.
Yeah. Yes, to answer your question about, well, it's not or objection really, saying that the Conservative Party was distracted basically and hobbled by various problems and the coalition and the pandemic and Brexit and so on. I don't really buy that, because the government did find time for all sorts of other things. It found time to ban plastic straws and tax carrier bags and introduce a sugar tax and any number of other things, banning house call and wild animals and travelling circuses. By the time Rishi Sunak called the early election so brilliantly, the bills going through Parliament there was something to do with regulating rickshaws in London. There was the tobacco and vapes bill, and there was the pet abduction bill, which was going to criminalise people trying to coax a cat down the pavement. So it's not as if they didn't have time to do anything. I just think their priorities were probably wrong. And to come back to your point about how do you sell freedom? Well, partially by pointing out what the consequences are, right? So it is undoubtedly true that lockdowns were not just very popular, but people wanted them to go on and on and on and on.
The nightclubs thing. When people
yes. Yeah.
They shut down nightclubs.
Apparently 20% of the population wanted to permanently close casinos and nightclubs. And I just think we have to accept that about 20% of the population are misanthropes, and that's all you can do about it. And there's I think that's pretty much proven by this poll. And there's nothing you can do about these people other than laugh at them. But the Conservative Party certainly shouldn't be trying to attract them. The SNP perhaps might be more natural home for them. But if you spell out what the consequences are, this is a problem. The lockdowns seem to have no consequences. If it had been explained to people that, you can have lockdowns for months and months and months, but we are going to print £375 billion. That is going to lead to 10% inflation in a year or two. And you're not going to like that very much, and you're going to boot us out of office as a result. If people knew this in advance, then they would obviously not support lockdowns. And the same is true of any other number of policies. The outdoor smoking ban, a small majority of people supposedly support this. But if the question was asked, do you support banning smoking in smoking areas, in pubs, if it means that the chance of your local going out of business rises from 10% to 50%, people would probably go, no, actually, I'm not that bothered about this particular issue, it's unreasonable to expect people to understand the consequences of all their actions. That's why we have politicians who are supposed to look into these things with a bit more detail. The other argument I often use, apparently quite unsuccessfully, is the kind of slippery slope you are next thing. And I suspect over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, it will become crystal clear to people who do not smoke that the same policies are now being levelled at them if they like eating food and drinking alcohol. But more than anything else, you don't actually need to sell it if you're in government. You can just do what I suggested in my opening remarks and just do nothing. And when some organisation comes up saying, we want you to do this, that, we say, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that, because we're the Conservative Party and we believe in individual freedom. And you will find there will not be much of a backlash from the general public. These things are not very salient, actually, to the general public. Most people couldn't care less. If asked in a survey, they will give the socially desirable answer very often, but it's not going to change how they fundamentally vote. There was a survey came out a couple of weeks ago showing that the tobacco and vapes bill is the lowest of all priorities for a whole list of bills, half of which I hadn't even heard of. But the tobacco and vapes bill was at the very bottom of it. People are not that bothered about these things, and nor should they be, because if you don't smoke, you shouldn't care about smoking restrictions. Same with vaping, same with so-called junk food, alcohol and everything else. And in fact, the proportion of the population that genuinely feel angry and hateful about these things and want the government to get involved is apparently around 20%.
Very good. I didn't get any questions from this side of the room, so let's do them. Let's do these two gentlemen here first.
Do we have a problem in the way that Whitehall is set up, and that we have departments for various different things? And if you set up a department and say your remit is to improve health or to improve the environment, there isn't that counterbalance that is in favour of freedom or in favour of liberty. So you can't really blame them that the default sort of instinct is just to do more and more and more stuff, even though there maybe isn't anybody sitting at the cabinet table whose explicit remit is standing up for freedom. Yeah,
we need a department for liberty. I like that.
Hello. So my question, Tom, you touched on the point, more or less took the words out of my mouth, actually, and Lord Frost as well, on the talking about economic freedom. One of the largest areas of economic growth in the UK is the property market. And I just want to know, has the Conservative Party, with the rent reforms bill and the fact that Michael Gove more or less took an opinion poll of Section 21, back and forth, or the public want this, let's bring it in. And then has Labour more or less jumped the gun with the reform on planning with these new towns? They've sort of more or less gone, as a developer myself, you go, well, with the Conservative Party, we've been holding back. And what you're saying from Derbyshire Dales, but the property market in the holiday lets, the restrictions, it's sort of one can't do what they want on their own property, but then Labour have come in and gone, let's build new towns.
A couple there. Let's do 1, 2 and 3.
Hello, thank you. We've identified the problem, but I'm not sure that we understand why the Conservative Party has given up on freedom. If we're to re-establish it in the next election, I don't think any of you have mentioned why we've given up.
Thanks for the session today. To me, the biggest clear and present danger to even more curtailment of our freedom is the green agenda for net zero, because that kind of impacts almost every aspect of freedom of choice, from what car you can drive, from what boiler you have in your house, how you build your house, etc. And to me, it's been driven by a group of activists who are against capitalism and free markets. So I just wondered if your views, because it's one of those things where if you ask people, do you care about the planet, they will say, of course we do, without understanding the consequences and the costs of what is now being implemented.
And there's up back there.
Thank you. Mike Salem, Consumer Choice Centre. The Lib Dems have made health and social policy as their key initiative. Labour is saying they're focusing on preventative measures, whatever that means. How should the Conservatives respond? And how do we solve I think what I'm trying to touch on is the problem of asymmetric information in the market. So how should the government deal with this, market failure, so-called? Thanks.
Well, we are running out of time. Tom, do you want to answer the housing question first?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think this is one of the big Conservative failures, particularly post 2019. I can remember doing an IEA panel. I wasn't working at the IEA at the time, online during the pandemic, and we're talking about prospects for free markets under the Johnson government. And I can very well remember sitting in my kitchen, as it was then, and saying, well, look, I don't know how much they're going to achieve, but they are going to fix planning. And if they do nothing else, that would be huge. That's really the only thing I'm asking for. And of course, it got completely derailed. Now, of course, there have been so many different efforts over the years, pretty much as long as we've had the current planning system. There have been efforts to try and reform it to deal with some of its adverse consequences. And we they always seem to run aground in the same way. And I'm not sure that we really learn the lessons from them. And I think that applies to Labour. I mean, new towns, this is new towns, sure, but it's not a new idea. When we pretty much froze development patterns in time with the Town and County Planning Act after the Second World War, the idea was, well, we're not going to have to sprawl, we're not going to do any more metro lands around London, for example, because we're going to build new towns instead. Now, it turns out, easier said than done. B, for the most part, people didn't like the new towns. A few of them were successful, but that completely ran out of steam. And then we had councils building social housing was picking up some of the slack for a while as well. Now, rightly, I think that that ran out of steam as well, and we had the great right to buy policy, because there are, I think, very significant negative consequences with mass government ownership of property and social tendencies and so on. But now, I mean, you look what Labour's doing, they're talking about new towns. I'm fairly confident that ground won't be broken on any new town worthy of the name in the next 5 years. They talked about planning passports. I think they had this thing last week. Now, by the way, there was a big difference between the press release that went out and some of the departmental documents backing it up, far less radical in practice than it seemed in theory. Even in theory, though, I wonder if they've looked at what happened to the Conservative government and Robert Jemmerich's proposed reforms, because they're really kind of proposing the same thing again without learning the lesson. So I don't want to give too long and sprawling an answer here. I think you need to have the right ideas about what you're trying to do with the planning system, and you're trying to remove a lot of bureaucratic discretion. You're trying to have more certainty. You're trying to speed things up. You're trying to let people have more control over property that they own and respond to market demands, right? So the ideas are there. You've got to work out how to implement them. But I think you also have to think really carefully about all of the different interest groups around housing and the ways that they will try and frustrate reforms. And I mean, the great thing about land use liberalisation is there is just so much money to be made from it. If you can take some of that money and divert it towards the people who would otherwise oppose development and stand in the way of it, they'd be over the moon, right? But I think we have to be clever about the policies and not just keep trying the same reforms, but trying harder. I think that's the real challenge.
It's really interesting. David, the Renters Reform Bill question, there's so much in that. I think, especially with regard to Section 21, which would effectively do away with what we might consider property rights. I mean, the idea that actually it's your property, you own it, and yet you would not be allowed to, as a landlord, do as you wish with that property, or indeed take it back into ownership, despite the fact the contract has already ended. So Section 21, the kind of no-fault eviction clause, although that's a misnomer in itself, why was that being spearheaded by a Conservative government?
Well, I think what was so bad about the Renters Reform Bill was not only that it was a response to opinion polling and very sort of superficial political analysis. It was that it to me, it sort of exemplified the refusal to look at root causes and constantly look at symptoms. And I was very influenced intellectually. When I first went to Brussels, I ended up working on the Common Agricultural Policy for a time. This is the 90s. And to me, that what I saw was a series of measures all designed to deal with the problems of the previous measure. You know, you had price support, you then had to control production, you then had to have sort of social measures for farmers to make up for the fact they couldn't produce as much as they wanted. You had to have a complicated agri-monetary system, and the whole system became more and more complicated. And the only policy was how do you mitigate these problems? And it seems to me we've got into exactly this situation with the UK property market and in all its different ways. Everything we do is about mitigating problems by taking measures that actually complicate and gum it up even further, making it more and more difficult to get back to where we want to go. And the renters reform seemed to me to kind of exemplify that. That's the core of the problem, but it really captures the intellectual weakness. Can I just answer one of the other questions, which was Whitehall departments and, you know, do we need a department for freedom and this sort of thing? I mean, I don't think we do. I think the problem is the way ministers are judged. You know, you're judged on have you done something and have you passed legislation? Have you responded to your pressure groups? And every department becomes the kind of mouthpiece of its own lobbyists after time and after a bit of time. And, we just need to change the incentives on people. And that can only come from the political party in charge. Only it can say we're not going to judge our success by the amount of legislation we pass. I think Nicholas Ridley said that once, and all the sort of hell descended on him, but nevertheless I think it's true. I think was it Reagan who said the best slogan was "Don't just do something, stand there," and that's what we need to get back to.
Yeah, I also wanted to touch on your question as well. I mean, one of the problems in the area of the nanny state is that Tony Blair created this new position of Minister for Public Health, which has always really been filled by someone relatively inexperienced but quite ambitious. And as soon as they get the job, they are immediately bombarded by various single-issue pressure groups saying you must do this about vaping or smoking or food or what have you. And they see an opening for quite a lot of press attention and being slapped on the back by lots of activist groups, and even possibly in the future getting some sort of award from the World Health Organization. Which has been known to happen. So, yeah, it does perverse incentives. Also, one of the worst things of the Andrew Lansley health reforms, he created these bloody public health directors. There's about 50 odd of them. Each local authority has one of these people who, again, they're completely useless during the pandemic because they don't actually know anything about real public health or infectious disease or even medicine. But they do know, or think they know, a lot about advertising and, how we should crack down on. In Sheffield, the guy up in Sheffield has managed to get through a ban on virtually everything. A ban on aeroplanes, a ban on cars, in addition to a ban on guns. I don't think they were advertised a lot in Sheffield, but that is now part of the local law, in addition to, of course, the usual stuff of food and vaping and all the rest of it. So you're creating these roles, and the only way these people can feel worthwhile is by doing lots of things that are bad. And that connects a bit to your question, sir, about, why did the Tory party give up on freedom? I don't think they did give up on freedom. I think if you ask someone like Michael Gove, he would consider himself to be freedom-loving and very sound. It just comes back to this problem of, I believe in free markets, but there's always a but there. There's always some perceived crisis that seems to the minister to be an exception here, whether it's people, paying too much for their rent, as they see it. And so although they're aware that this is their solution, or the solution that's been foisted upon them by pressure groups, is not in line with their ideology, they will quite happily make an exception for it. The trouble is, it very soon becomes like Swiss cheese. There's nothing left because you've got so many ministers all making exceptions for things in their own particular department. Yeah.
So we are at the moment. Tom, final word.
Sure. Because I wanted to come back to your question as well about why. And I think it is very easy, especially for those of us who have never run for elected office and never will run for elected office, to just blame the politicians for being feckless or lazy or whatever. And I'm sure that might sometimes be true, but I want to go back to something I said earlier, which is I think politics and government really is downstream of the intellectual culture. And if you have this zeitgeist of collectivism, politics is probably going to follow that. And I do think that people like that, okay, we're just one small organisation, but the whole constellation of individuals and groups that support free market ideas, I think we probably have to look at ourselves a little bit here as well and think to the extent that we were successful in the 60s and the 70s in changing the intellectual climate, and then the 80s politics seemed to follow. How did we fail in more recent decades? So even when you had supposedly freedom-loving conservative governments, why did they not have that intellectual climate around them? And I think to a certain extent it was just kind of taking our eye off the ball a little bit. A lot of people bought into this Francis Fukuyama kind of end of history thing, or even just the Washington consensus, sort of neoliberalism had won. Everyone accepted the tenets of free markets, and no serious person really questioned all of this stuff. Well, it turns out a few years later, not only do lots of people have completely antithetical views to all of that, but actually because you haven't been talking about these things, you haven't been talking about the underlying ideas because you haven't been perhaps sufficiently utopian or inspiring enough about them, times have moved on and you find yourself intellectually massively out of fashion. And so politics does, I think, what it's going to do in those circumstances. The question now is, how do we make a big difference over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, however long it takes, to make sure that we can have another big moment of free market liberalisation?
Indeed. Yeah, make freedom popular again, I think is the aim there. Well, thank you to my very, very wonderful panel, and thank you to all of you for coming.